Hello and welcome to AR on AR. I'm Adam Rose and today we're going to be talking about the EcoChallenge. I wasn't really going to be giving comments on the race itself because I'm not intending to focus on races too much, but I thought with this particular one, because I had so many requests, in fact one person asked me to give some comments on it, I thought I'd just give my 2 cents. So I'm looking at maybe top 10 tips for people, especially newbies, who watch the race on TV and now want to know more. Now bear in mind, we only really followed 14 teams properly in the entire race, and my comments are going to be focused around what we saw on the race, not so much on what happened off camera or race reports or anything else like that, but what we saw and what is it that we can learn from what we saw. I'll also point out that EcoChallenge Fiji 2019 was an amazing event. Was it the longest, hardest, toughest adventure race ever? No, not by a long shot. You'll even hear from people who stood on the podium that wasn't their toughest race ever. There are some events that I've watched unfold where only one team managed to finish the entire course. So, there's a whole spectrum out there. But yes, it was certainly tough, and we certainly heard very experienced racers having very dark moments, very bleak moments, and then still managing to push through. I just want to preface this by saying, if I mention your team by name, don't take it personally. I wasn't there. I was sitting on the couch, watching, or in this case, watching EcoChallenge on TV. So, it's nothing personal, but I'm sure every team that participated in that race learned something, little ways to improve, little takeaways, little things that they could do better, because that's the nature of adventure racing. So these are just comments from one observer. So in no particular order, I'm just going to run through what I think are 10 takeaways that you could benefit from, especially if you're a newcomer to adventure racing. Race the course, not the other teams. Okay, that's quite a common occurrence, especially at the beginning of a race when people get so excited about what's unfolding. Even experienced teams will rush off the start line. And I'm not saying that Bend Racing was doing that. Bend Racing has plenty of experience, they know what they're doing. They just happened to find themselves at the front and they knew how to pedal and they were doing really well. And if Daniel hadn't suffered from the heat stroke, I'm sure they would have stayed right up near the front, if not at the very front. But it's very common for teams to rush off the start line, especially newbie teams. They burn themselves out too quickly. Okay, so you've got to focus on the course and not focus on the other teams. You've got to focus on running your own race as a team and not comparing yourselves to other teams and how they're doing. And especially when it comes to navigation, it's so common for teams to look at some other team going off on a bearing somewhere and to say, well, maybe they know where they're going and let's just follow them. And admittedly, in I think episode 9, we saw up to 10 teams following one team to the next transition. Now, I'm not saying you can't follow other teams, but what you have to really do generally is focus on what your team can do and focus on your team's strengths and not get distracted or diverted off course just by the behavior of other teams. Run your own race. Next takeaway is teams getting separated. What I mean by that is team members separating from other team members. And we saw that to quite a negative consequence with quite a few teams, especially on the bike, where it's quite easy for some team members to get ahead of other team members. You get these people who are really fit, feeling good, feeling strong, and they pull away from the slower team members at the back. We saw that cause quite a few problems. With Team Onyx, we saw that bike crash that happened, and the team members at the front had no idea what had happened to their teammate at the back. So a golden rule in adventure racing is you should always be able to see each other, and really you should be within earshot of each other. You should not, and that's according to the rules of most of these expedition races certainly, you're not supposed to be out of earshot because emergencies can happen, accidents can happen. So the rules generally stipulate you have to remain within a certain distance. On foot, the same kind of thing can happen. We didn't see it so much in this race, but it's quite common for a team to get stretched out and you have somebody soldiering at the front and somebody lagging at the back. And that isn't a team. That isn't a team operating as a team. That's 4 individuals, hopefully trying to work together to, cross that finish line, but that isn't a team functioning as a team. You know, I'm not pointing fingers, I'm saying it happens. And it's one of those things as an adventure racer you've got to learn to do is you can only really go as fast as the slowest member of the team, ultimately. So you need to stick together and encourage and boost the confidence of somebody who's feeling weak, of somebody who's going slow. There is nobody who stays strong throughout an entire race. Everybody goes through, especially an expedition race, goes through weak periods or down times, and they need the encouragement of the team around them, not the team sitting waiting at a junction, you know, where are you, why aren't you here? Okay, so it can make a big difference to the overall speed of the team if the team sticks together. Literally in talking distance, literally chatting, boosting each other's morale, carrying each other's packs, all that kind of stuff. Okay, my next point is something that my team members know that I'm often on about, and I'm just going to call it owning the fat. What's interesting about adventure races is they aren't generally the leanest, meanest, toughest, CrossFit-looking type athletes out there. In fact, if you look at those lead teams who stood on the podium, you know, they don't represent what most people would consider the height of athleticism. I would go so far as to say they had, especially the men, they had dad bods, and yet they won the race. So those of you who are considering going to Patagonia, you need to not only not be ashamed of carrying some extra pounds, I would say for Patagonia, you need to put on extra pounds. You know, if you're extremely lean and mean, you're going to have very low body fat, you are going to suffer. We saw that happen in Fiji when teams were getting into that freezing cold water above the first rope section after they climbed up that waterfall. We saw a bunch of men, especially, who generally have a lower body fat percentage than women, really struggling to keep their body warm. For Patagonia, you want excess pounds on your body. The next point is really critical. You need to communicate issues between the team members. It's really important that you are constantly communicating how you're feeling, if you have any issues, if you're starting to develop a blister, if you've got a scratch, if you think there's an infection. We saw one of those teams, Team Flying J in this case, where a team member got a serious infection which was becoming life-threatening sepsis, and the team had to drop out of the race. Now, we learned while watching that episode that the rest of the team weren't aware that their team member had this serious infection of his leg. And, you know, I can't fault them, and I'm not trying to criticize them, but it was interesting to hear team members saying, I didn't know that he was suffering with this issue. For adventure racing teams to function properly, they need to be constantly communicating. There mustn't be any ego, and I'm not saying there was in that particular instance, but there mustn't be this mentality of I'll just push through for the team and keep it to myself. If the team doesn't know about an issue that's developing, they can't help you. They can't carry your pack, they can't take your burden, they can't tend to the wounds that you have, or in this case, the infection. And as we can see, if one team member drops out, the entire team is disqualified. The entire team's race comes to an end. So it's really critical that team members are constantly letting the other team members know what's going on. The next issue is dangerous shortcuts. We saw a number of teams, including elite teams, taking shortcuts in the jungle. And that led to unhappy consequences where they spent many hours going around in circles. So my takeaway here for newcomer teams especially is if you are going to go off course, there's nothing wrong with that in itself. And in fact, adventure races don't have any course, as it were. You know, you just have checkpoints, and it's up to each team to decide how they want to get from this checkpoint to the next checkpoint. So it's not that those elite teams were going off course in any formal sense, but they took a gamble trying to get from one checkpoint to another, and they got lost. So if you're a newcomer team, if you do decide to take a risky shortcut, make sure you have something which we call a catching feature. It's in other words, a backstop. So for example, if I'm going to take a bearing and just go straight through the jungle, you know, there needs to be something that points out if I've gone too far or if I'm going off the right track. So it could be a wall, it could be a cliff, it could be a hill, it could be a beach. So if you have these catching features, then you know when you've gone too far, or you know if you've gone too far to the left or too far to the right. So those are very simple catching features. My team often accuses me of taking too many shortcuts, and that leads me going around in circles, just like we saw in the EcoChallenge. But nothing wrong with shortcuts, but you need to have contingency plans available in case you go off course and then you find yourself lost. The next one, we didn't see much in EcoChallenge, and that is towing your team. It's a really big advantage in adventure racing to tow your teammates. So whether it's on foot or on bike, which is where you generally see people being towed, or even on kayak, if you have kayaks or canoes, it's really helpful to tow somebody who's not performing at their best. And the person who is being towed is not getting a free ride. You know, if I'm towing somebody on a bicycle, it doesn't mean the person that I'm towing, the person behind me, is just taking their feet off the pedals. They've got to pedal just as if I wasn't towing them. But it's a little encouragement. It's enough encouragement. It's almost like if you put your hand behind somebody's back and you run alongside them. We can see it in this picture here. Just that little pressure, that gentle pressure can make all the difference to how fast the slower team member is going to go. So by towing somebody, the entire team's speed will be increased. It won't be as fast as the fastest, but it'll be faster than that slowest member would go if they were doing all their work on their own. So if you get offered a tow, just accept it. If your team member says to you, do you want a tow rope? What they're actually saying delicately is, take the tow rope. They're not really asking. They're just hinting, look, you need to take it, and you've got to suppress your own ego if it gets offered to you. And in fact, my attitude is if somebody offers me a tow rope, I'm going to joyfully accept it because it's only for the team's benefit, and it's, you know, I'm going to benefit from it, I know. So don't feel too proud or too strong to accept the offer of a tow rope, which is really telling you to take the tow rope. Working together is critical for successful adventure racing. Now, in EcoChallenge Fiji, we didn't see much in the way of bickering or fighting or divisiveness between team members. And I was curious about that. And I thought, had the producers of this series just decided to hide all that stuff? Or were people actually getting on in the most part? Were they actually working well together as a unit? And having spoken to people who participated in the race, very experienced racers, it seems generally teams performed well together, which is very encouraging. But that's not always the case. In the original EcoChallenge series, the episode on Saba in Borneo, we saw Team Speed, the French team, that actually came second. They stood on the podium in second position, talking about how they, as a team, suppress all dissension or division that might arise during a race. It's fine to vent afterwards. It's fine to air your grievances afterwards. But any division that happens during a race is simply going to slow the team down. So they make it a policy before the race. Listen, if there's any irritation, keep it to yourself. Park it on one side. It's not saying they're not going to address it, but they'll address it when the time is right. And the time to do that is after the race. And you might even find by the time the race finishes that resentment or irritation has evaporated anyway. And as a consequence, they don't waste energy. They don't waste momentum. They simply focus on the goal, which is to finish the race as fast as possible. And as I said, that's how in that race they came second. The most common reason that teams drop out of an adventure race, especially expedition length races, is due to the condition of their feet. If your feet fail, if you can't walk anymore, pretty much that's your race done. And if one person drops out, the entire team has to drop out. Now, here's a little tip. Yes, you need to look after yourself. But what you really should focus on is the other team members. Instead of each team member focusing on their own well-being, each team member looking after their own feet or the chafing or the weight of their pack, what the team members ultimately, the best thing they can do is focus on the needs of the other team members. And that way, in a 4-person team, you'll have 3 team members looking out for your welfare. And that is a successful team. It's not 4 people each looking after themselves. It's each person being looked after by the other 3. I think it is Nathan Favai who said this, that You should be constantly looking to see, how can I take the burden for somebody else? How can I make somebody else's race easier? And if each team member is doing that, can I carry a pack? Can I make sure your foot placement is right? Can I help you assemble that bike? Can I navigate? That is the way to really, really be efficient. And that comes back to the point I mentioned earlier about that constant communication, constantly checking. Have you got this? Are you ready with that? Is that okay? You've got to nip issues in the bud. And if you're constantly looking out for your friends, literally showing them some love, that team is going to function at a much higher level than a team where each team member is working individually. A critical point which many newcomer teams have to learn is to remember that it's a race. And we saw that in EcoChallenge Fiji, when a number of the teams that got eliminated because they weren't fast enough just hadn't had the urgency of teams further up the field. They didn't have the experience to know that even though you're not racing the other teams, you're racing the course more than anything. And even though you mustn't compare yourself to other teams, you also have to remember it is a race. Yes, it's an adventure, but it is also a race. If people take the opportunity to relax too much or to take it too slow, especially in a transition area, they will find themselves cut off quite easily. Most expedition races are not the duration of an eco-challenge. They're not 10, 11 days long. They tend to be maximum usually of about 7 days. Just like in triathlon, you have to consider when you come into transition, it's not an opportunity to rest so much as an opportunity to transition to the next discipline. So much time is lost in transition by teams that don't know any better. But then they learn, of course. Okay, my final takeaway, and the thing that I consider the most important takeaway from just watching EcoChallenge Fiji, is efficiency. The teams that top the podium are the most efficient teams. They are not the fittest teams. They are not the strongest teams. They're not the youngest teams. They are the most efficient teams. Just for example, take a trekking leg. The teams that stood on the podium didn't necessarily run any faster or trek any faster. In pure kilometers per hour, they did not generally move faster than teams in the mid-pack, or even teams towards the tail end. But what they were is more efficient. You know, nobody in an adventure race, especially an expedition race, I should say, tends to move very fast. The overall speed of trekking or kayaking or mountain biking tends to be fairly slow because it's over such a long period. So the efficiency absolutely is the biggest impact on where you are. If we consider that the three teams that stood on the podium were over 100 kilometers further along on the course than those teams towards the back, how did that happen when they all started at the same time? It's how efficient those teams were. When you get into transition, not wasting a single second. When you taking a sleep, being efficient at your sleep. When you're packing, when you're organizing, when you're breaking your bike down, putting into a bike box, being efficient. And we see this in the very top teams. They work so well together as a unit. They barely have to say anything. They already know what other team members need, and they each know what their role is. When they arrive in transition, they already know what they need to do. They are not getting into transition and then starting to ask questions. When I race with my team, we have this method, this protocol, that before we reach transition, we've already discussed what we're going to be doing. So by the time you hit transition, it's no longer a question, it's already known. That is what makes the single biggest difference, in my opinion anyway, between how well your team does, everything else being equal. In fact, you'll see with Team New Zealand in their interviews, they don't claim to be the fastest. But I think most teams watching them in operation, it's almost like a single organism with 4 members forming that single unit. They are the best at getting the job done without any fuss, without any bother, and getting on to the next stage in this case. Okay, hopefully that was useful. Those are just 10 of the things that I observed from watching this race on Amazon. I'm sure that you have observations, maybe better ones than I made, and I welcome you to add those in the comments, especially if some newbies are watching this episode, they could benefit from your wisdom. Okay, sharing is caring. Okay, thanks. See you next time.